Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim chapter 4, Halacha 5. It's going to be a short Gemara. Now, the Mishnah is going to get into what is a vineyard, but it's going to play with the ownership structure. And we've done this before where you're having partners. We did this in Masechet Peah. What happens if you have a partner that's a Jew and a non-Jew, and then how do you determine Peah, things like that. Well, over here we're trying to determine what's a vineyard, what's going to count as a vineyard. We know that Bet Shammai is saying that it's 5 vines in a row. We know that Bet Hillel, which the halacha follows, is saying that it is going to be 2 rows. It's going to be 5 vines, but it's going to be 2 and 3. Perhaps you can have a small vineyard. Small vineyard, halachically, is going to count as 6 vines. Now, we're playing with this where we're going to say, what happens if somebody puts 3 vines on my property, and I own the property, and I plant 3 vines on your property? And is that going to combine to create a halachic vineyard? That's where we're going on this. So we're really getting into like a type of partnership. And why? Because one person owns only 3 of the vines, and the other person owns 3 of the vines. So the Mishnah is going to start off. It's going to say if someone plants 1 row of vines between his property and 1 row of vines within his fellow's property, again, that can be 2 and 3, or it can be 3 and 3 to qualify as a small vineyard. But nonetheless, you only have possession of 3 of the vines, and he only has possession of the 3 of the vines. Question is, does that combine to form a vineyard? And the Mishnah says, and there was a private road or a public road between the 2 rows, or there's a wall that is lower than 10 tefakim. These rows combine to constitute a vineyard. So not only is half of this vineyard on my property and half of this vineyard on your property, it goes deeper than that. It pushes the boundary, so to speak. And it says, no, there's also a road between these 2. Or there's a wall that's less than 10 tefakim between them, and it's saying, yes, it's still combined. So not only is the property ownership structure going to be different, but also there's something that's interposing between the 2. And the idea is going to be, well, how far is this road going to be? And how, because, when you're talking about making a vineyard, how do you connect the 2 vines? How far does row 1 and row 2 have to be in order to connect? We're going to get into that in chapter 4, Halacha 5 and 6, because it's going to really get into the differences. We know that it's going to be 4 amos, and so you're going to be able to say that, over here is going to be 4 amos, and over here is going to be 4 amos to add up to 8 amos. But you could also say that it's going to be, 4 amos, but we're also going to be getting into an opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The sugya is actually going to be taking all of this and trying to go with an opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai if you want to plant foreign species. And ultimately, it's going to try to figure out the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai to reaffirm this, because ultimately Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is even going to agree with all of this. He takes the position that you can't nullify somebody else's property, and if you want to do foreign species, things like that. But this is going to be different because this is the way it was planted, constituting a vineyard. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. In the halacha, if I come onto your property and plant 3 vines onto your property, whose property is it? The answer is it's your property. But in the halacha, I'm entitled to get reimbursed for the work to put in the vines. It's going to be, in secular law in the United States, something akin to quantum merit, where they know that you're doing work on the other guy's property and they can charge you for it because you didn't remove it, you didn't ask them to stop, you didn't leave it, you just accepted the value. You let them do the work, you accepted the value, and therefore they can owe you the labor. And that's going to be a similar idea to what's going on over here. So they actually own the vines. You've improved their property, but they can claim in a bet din, they can claim reimbursement for the labor to put in those things. Look, it's not a really likely thing to happen, but again, it's trying to play with ownership structure. Because then again, you might say, well, wait a second. What happens if this is a non-Jew that owns the 3 vines and I have a partnership and, I have, let's say, half of it and you have half of it, and I have half the vines and he has half the vines. Are these still going to combine to form a vineyard? The answer is yes. It's still going to combine to form a vineyard. So there's going to be a dissent about the wall, and it's going to say that if the wall is higher than 10 tefachim, the rows do not combine to constitute a vineyard. That, by the way, is the position of the Tanna Kama. In other words, the Tanna Kama is saying that a 10 tefachim wall is a boundary, even for trees, by the way. And so if you've divided now these 2 rows, they're not going to combine now to constitute a vineyard. By the way, if you're going to go plant foreign seed within 3 of those vines, because it doesn't count as a vineyard, the setback is going to be 6 tefachim from each other. But if the rows do combine because the wall is lower than that, then it's going to be where it is going to be where it's going to combine, and it's going to be 4 tefachim for a setback. Now, getting into this wall or this road, if you have a road that's going to be less than 8 amos, the idea is that if it's 8 amos, the rows do not constitute a vineyard, since the 2 rows do not combine to form a vineyard if they're going to be 8 amos or more apart. So, it's playing with distances. We know that, there's 4 amos over here for setbacks, there's 4 amos over here for setbacks. What it's trying to do is trying to play with it to say, like, look, these 3 rows are going to say, okay, there's 4 amos setback, and these 3 rows over on my property are going to combine for a 4 amos setback. So let's say mine is only 3 away and yours is 4 away. That's going to be 7. So it's going to connect. And so this is a roundabout way to say that, look, a vineyard is going to constitute something depending on how far the other vines are growing next to it. And so if you're going to be more than 8 tefachim or 8 amos apart, then these vines are not going to combine to form a vineyard. That's why it's important that they mention this public or private road here, because it can be in certain circumstances where it's too wide, and then these are just two sets of 3 standalone vines by themselves. But again, if it's 8 amos or smaller, these connect together. So the the Mishnah is going to continue, and there's a dissent. Rabbi Yudah says that if he intertwined the vines above the wall, in other words, you have a 10 tefachim wall, we know that that's a boundary, but now he's wrapping the vines above the wall. The Mishnah says then even if it is higher than 10 tefachim, they combine to constitute a vineyard. This, by the way, is where you are lifting up the vines on top of the wall, and it's going to be where you're using this like a trellis. And basically, this position is saying that the rows are going to combine now to form a vineyard, because you're not looking at the wall as something to separate anymore. The vines on this side and the vines on that side are being thrown over onto the wall, and basically you've combined the two to make it a trellis. Now, the Tanna Kama is holding that a 10 tefach wall is a separator even if the vines are intertwined over the wall. That, by the way, is the commentary by the Rambam. But nonetheless, this gives us a lot of food for thought. The Gemara is going to wonder whether the Mishnah's first ruling is unanimous, whether everybody agrees with this. What is it? It's going to say if somebody plants 1 row of vines within his property and 1 row of vines within his fellow's property, and then you have the private or public road or a wall smaller than 10 tefachim high, that it's going to combine. They want to know, wait a second, we know that there's this famous dissent from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Is he going to agree with that? Is that something that he would agree with? And again, this is coming along to say, wait a second, can he disqualify, or can the owner disqualify somebody else's property? And if they can, in what case? And that's really where we're going. We're really going with and in what case. So Rabbi Achai says, does this Mishnah not dispute the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? Because Rabbi Shimon says that a person cannot render forbidden that which is not his. In other words, this is going to be coming up later on in Kilayim chapter 7, Halacha 3. And the idea is that if you're spreading the grapevine over your neighbor's standing grain over in the Mishnah there, he's not going to render that grain prohibited for benefit, even though it should be considered kalei karam. In other words, the idea that Rabbi Shimon is saying that is that a person can't make something forbidden that's not his. And Rabbi Achai is questioning that, well, could it be where the neighbor's vines should not be able to combine with your own vines on your property to connect the two together as a vineyard, and therefore change the setback so that instead of having the larger setback because you have a vineyard, you have a smaller setback because you have 3 vines. In other words, he's really asking, would Rabbi Shimon say, wait a second, by allowing this to combine with the other, you now have taken away a little bit of space between the two that you could have used to plant some foreign species, because if you just have 3 vines, the setback is only 6 tefachim. Again, a tefach is going to be a handbreadth. So instead of being 4 amos is going to be from the elbow to the end of your hand, and that's going to be significantly longer than 6 tefachim. So 6 tefachim is going to be about 1 amma. Anyway, so the idea is that perhaps you've cut off a little bit of this land, and you could have planted something within this difference between the 1 amma and the 4 amma. You could have planted a little bit. Why? Because you're saying it's 3 individual vines, and really what you're saying, or Rabbi Achai is asking and questioning and saying, could it be that Rabbi Shimon would consider this a taking? How is it a taking? Because you're saying that these 3 sets of vines, or 2 and 3 vines, have connected together somehow by being close enough apart that they've now combined. You can actually get it to where this 4 amos and that 4 amos between this row A and row B, actually connect. And, this is somebody else's property, yes, and mine is my property. But by allowing them to connect, you cut down on the space in between these 2 rows that perhaps could be planted. And by doing that, perhaps you are taking something. That's really the question that we want to know if Rabbi Shimon would agree with. And the Gemara is going to answer this, that there Rabbi Shimon said only that a person cannot, through his own initiative, render forbidden that which is not his. But here, however, the Mishnah is teaching that one's own vines and one's fellow vines do combine to prohibit foreign seed planted by either party in between these vines or within 4 amos on the other side of them. In other words, let's say if I just have 3 vines and Rabbi Shimon's not going to let these 2 vines on your property combine, well, if I'm planting on the outside area, not between the 2 sets of vines, but on the other side, instead of doing 4 amma setback, you could say, well, it's just 3 vines, and I'm going to make a 6 tefachim setback and start planting something else. And the question is, if these 2 are going to be consisting of individual vines or vines that have now connected between the 2 property owners, you could end up prohibiting foreign seed for both owners and also cutting back the amount of plantable area. So that could be, one way to look at it, where you've rendered forbidden that which is not his. In other words, perhaps you're going to say, well, if you're going to follow the Mishnah, and if Rabbi Shimon might follow the Mishnah and is going to allow these vines on the other guy's property to connect with your 3 vines, it's only 3 vines, and say, no, this is a vineyard now. Well, you now have cut down on the amount of arable land that I can plant next to it or between it. That's the question. Now, the Gemara is going to cite another Amarah. This is not just an Amarah. This is Rabbi Manna, who was the Rosh Yeshiva and one of the last Amorim to talk about things in the Yerushalmi. And he's going to suggest that the Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, but it's not going to be for the reason you think. He's going to say like this. Rabbi Manna did not say so. In other words, he never considered to say that our Mishnah might contradict Rabbi Shimon's ruling that one cannot forbid that which is not his, because he understood that in our Mishnah's case, the prohibition is generated by a vineyard partly belonging to each of the neighbors. In other words, there's joint ownership. How's there joint ownership? Because I have 3 vines and you have 2 or 3 vines, or you have 3 vines and I have 2 or 3 vines, and now this is a halachic vineyard, although you're going to be able to collect the grapes on your side of the vineyard, and I'm going to collect the grapes on my side of the vineyard. However, the vineyard partly belongs to the 2 neighbors. And the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Mana is asking like this. He's saying, did Rabbi Shmuel not say the following in the name of Rabbi Zera? This, by the way, is something that came up earlier, where it says Rabbi Shimon ruled that when there are 2 adjacent wheat fields belonging to different people, it is permitted to plant a furrow of a different kind between them. This, by the way, was coming with test furrows. You can see this in chapter 2, Halacha 5, in the Art Scroll, page 17a. And the idea is that you want to see is, hey, I'm not really planting this because I'm trying to harvest the seed in this crop. I'm just planting this for a short period of time to see if it sprouts and see how well it does. And I'm going to cut it down. I'm not actually going to even harvest this. So the idea is that you can plant a single furrow at the end of the field, even within the field, and even if it's planted with something else, but you can't plant it in the middle of the field where it'd be closed in on both sides. And the idea that comes up many, many times is that, the Tanakh is holding that just as one is forbidden to plant a single furrow in the middle of his own wheat field, you're also not allowed to plant between his own wheat field and the neighbor's wheat field, because this furrow gets closed in by both sides of the wheat field. And we've covered this before in chapter 2. There's a nervousness in the Yerushalmi about species on 2 sides of things closing in something in the middle. The Tanakh say, look, if you have your wheat field on your side of the property and I have on my side, and at the end of my property between these 2, I'm going to plant this test strip. Tanakh say, look, in certain circumstances, depending on the spacing, it can look like it's getting closed in. They forbid it. So maybe Rabbi Mana is saying that the idea that they're worried about, Rabbi Shimon's worried about this getting closed in. What could be closed in here? Well, what if you're trying to plant something between these 2 sets of vines? Perhaps Rabbi Shimon would say that maybe you're closing in the middle thing, the middle foreign species that you're trying to plant between the 2. And we know that there's a phobia in the Yerushalmi about this kind of thing. That's why there's such a large system of setbacks. And even, by the way, this could be an explanation why Bet Shammai is going to add a penalty if you have a burnt-out vineyard and you're trying to plant in the middle, and how much setbacks there could be. They're going to add 50% to the setbacks from what Hillel does as a penalty. Why? Because they might also be worried about the appearance of closing in the middle crops. So the question is, can you end up make something that belongs to somebody else forbidden? And maybe that could be done by closing things in. So Rabbi Shimon says this Gemara rule that when people, where they have 2 adjacent wheat fields belonging to different people, it's permitted to plant a furrow of a different kind between them. And that's consistent with his own opinion stated elsewhere, because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that a person cannot render forbidden that which is not his. In other words, he cannot forbid the neighbor's grain by draping his adjacent grapevine over it. So perhaps over here, says the Gemara, that Rabbi Shimon says that a person cannot render closed in that which is not his. In other words, if you're going to plant this test strip in the middle, perhaps Rabbi Shimon is saying that, look, if this was a case where you owned both fields, you couldn't plant the test strip in the middle because depending on the layout, there's a danger that you might end up closing in the middle field. And the Tanakh probably would agree with that. But the worry here is that, look, one wheat field doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the other guy. And so your test strip belongs to you and your wheat field belongs to you. And the Tanakama are saying, yes, you can forbid something that belongs to somebody else. What would that be? How would that work? Well, you would say, wait a second, his wheat field is forbidding my test strip because it's on the other side of my test strip. And the test strip belongs to me, and the wheat field that he has over there belongs to him. This is not just like, oh, you have some blank land that belongs to you, and I have a wheat field over here and a test strip, and the test strip is next to your blank field. No. The idea is that my test strip is in between my wheat field. I own that. But your wheat field over there, according to Tanakama, is nullifying the middle thing. Why? The middle test strip is because it's nullified because you're closing it in. There was always a worry that you're going to be, closing the species and it's going to look like Kilayim, and they may actually grow in together and actually be ending up as Kilayim. Certainly in the cases of melons and gourds and beans, that happens a lot. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is going to be holding that one can't forbid his fellow. So it would follow that in this Mishnah's case, it would look like because each neighbor owns part of the vineyard, Rabbi Shimon might hold that the shared vineyard can't forbid foreign seed planted by either one of them. And is that not going to contradict Rabbi Shimon's opinion? So, you would say, well, wait a second, maybe these aren't going to combine. And if you did allow them to combine, you would end up forbidding me to plant a foreign species between these two because you cut down my arable land. So the Gemara is going to answer it like this, and actually is going to come up with the opinion that actually the Mishnah is going to end up fitting with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's opinion. That is a shocker. And here's the nuance. The Gemara says, there in the case of closing in, it is reasonable to apply Rabbi Shimon's principle that a person cannot render forbidden that which is not his. In other words, Rabbi Shimon would agree with that. In other words, Rabbi Shimon would say that you can plant the test strip between my wheat field and your wheat field. The Tanakama say no. Tanakama say no, you're boxing it in, you're surrounding it. And Rabbi Shimon would say back, although the halacha is not by Rabbi Shimon, he would say that, look, I'm allowed to plant on my own property, and I don't have a wheat field on the other side of it. You do. And your wheat field is prohibiting what I have on my property and the ownership here. And he has a rule that you can't forbid something that belongs to somebody else. So since this furrow gets closed in on one side purely by one's own crop and the other side purely by the neighbor's crop, this is a case where you would end up forbidding something that's not his. And you've closed it in. And Rabbi Shimon holds that the neighbor does not have this ability when he plants. You can't end up disqualifying somebody else's property, he says. But the Gemara explains here in this Mishnah, in the case of the vineyard, the neighbor's vines do not, strictly speaking, render anything forbidden. In other words, you didn't forbid anything. There's nothing there that you've turned off. And the Gemara continues, says, rather, one's own vines and his fellow vines do combine to constitute a vineyard. And it is by the virtue of being a vineyard that they prohibit any foreign seed planted in between them or between 4 amos of them if they're going to be put onto the other side. So the Pnei Moshe is going to be saying like this, that in essence, one's vines attain the vineyard status first. And each part of the vineyard now has the capacity to forbid foreign seed. And since every part of the vineyard needs a 4-area work area, it's one's own share of the vineyard prohibiting any foreign seed within the work area of the property. It's not the neighbor's share of the vineyard prohibiting any foreign seed within the work area. And therefore, it's not a case of anyone rendering forbidden that which is not his. And accordingly, all the Meforshim are agreeing that Rabbi Shimon would agree with this Mishnah. In other words, the idea is that this is a vineyard. He agrees this is a vineyard. And now that it's a vineyard, you have to obey the laws of a vineyard for setbacks. And if this were a case where he'd say that, look, you're not disqualifying anything because it doesn't combine, and therefore you just have a collection of vines, and I have a collection of vines, and now I can just, the worry is that, oh well, maybe if I'm planting foreign seed here, maybe there could be setback issues. You might forbid somebody else's thing. Rabbi Shimon says, no, 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 no. Forget about planting anything. This is halachically a vineyard, and because it's halachically a vineyard, you have to obey by the laws and abide by the laws of the vineyard. These are what the setbacks is. This is what the setbacks are for between this row of vines and that row of vines. You can't plant stuff between it. So now that it's a vineyard, you didn't preclude anything from anybody. So by agreeing in the beginning that it's a vineyard, you never got to that step, that next step of saying, well, you could be precluding something from someone else. And they're saying that Rabbi Shimon would end up agreeing with that. Now, the Mishnah in Halacha 6 is going to finish up chapter 4, and we're going to be getting into the configurations and minimum numbers of vines and rows that are going to constitute a vineyard, and then we get back into closing in sets of rows and how that's going to be working to qualify a vineyard. So very, very subtle here. In other words, because you're not applying Rabbi Shimon's principle that you're rendering something else forbidden, which is not his, you never got there, because halachically he's saying it's a vineyard. It's combined. And because it's combined, you don't disqualify anything. So have a great day. And it's important to learn the details of all the halachot.